If your creative push has helped you on your creative journey, consider helping the show by becoming a patron. Patrons get access to episodes and YouTube videos the week before they're released, and they also find out about and get to ask questions to upcoming guests before I interview them. For $1, $5, or $10 a month, you can give back to the show and help me help more creative people like you who need the push. Thank you so much to my existing patrons, and thank you for considering to help the cause. And either way, on behalf of the universe, thank you for listening and creating. Your Creative Push, episode 344.
That's how the world works. That's how creativity works. It doesn't work from being a machine or a factory or anything else. Period.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is Daniel José Older. Daniel is the New York Times bestselling author of the middle grade historical fantasy series Dactyl Hill Squad, Star Wars Last Shot, and the Shadowshaper Cypher, which won the International Latino Book Award and was also named one of Esquire's 80 books every person should read. And I took that advice and I read the book. When we spoke, I was actually halfway through the book, and then I finished it. It was amazing, and now I am halfway through Star Wars Last Shot. Daniel is a fantastic writer, and I was so stoked to get him on the podcast, and he totally delivered in this episode. And in this episode, Daniel talks about what it was like to be a New York City paramedic, how he made the transition from paramedic to full-time writer, and how the essence of being a writer isn't what you've read in books, but what you've experienced in your life. Daniel also discusses the importance of listening in writing and in other creative pursuits, and what the Jedi can teach writers when it comes to finding their voice. Daniel also talks about the experience of Shadowshaper getting rejected 40 times, how he persevered through that process, and the advice that changed the entire trajectory of that book. He also talks about the writing process, using humor, writing the other, and why we shouldn't italicize other languages. And finally, Daniel and I talk about why everyone should write a book, but not everybody should publish one, why he spent the last year of his life not writing, and how he's pushed through many of his resistances, most notably confidence and not knowing whether it was in him to write a good enough book to be worth writing a book at all. And also, I'd like to let you know that this episode does contain some explicit language, so if there's some young ears around, maybe shield them from some bad words. But it's really not that bad. But anyway, please sit back, relax, and prepare to be inspired by my guest today, Daniel José Older. Daniel, welcome to Your Creative Push, man.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for coming on. I was just telling you that I'm kind of neck deep in your book right now. Like I'm getting to, I feel like what's going to be the conclusion very, very soon.
Yes.
I think I'm on chapter like 36 or so.
Mm-hmm,
And ooh, it's getting good.
Oh, good. Excellent. Excellent. You're talking about Shadowshaper.
Shadowshaper, yes.
Very cool.
And there's so many books of yours that I want to read now, and I do want to talk about Star Wars as well because I'm a huge nerd.
Oh, good. Me too. Me too.
And I want to talk about that experience too.
Yeah.
But before we get into anything really, I was wondering if you could maybe introduce yourself to the listeners. Just tell them how you got to the point you are now, creatively speaking, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's a big question. So my autobiography.
I know,
right?
It's a huge one.
Well, my name is Daniel José Older. I'm a writer. I was a paramedic for 10 years. And during that time, I also was a musician, composer, and organizer. And that definitely is kind of my path to writing, in the sense that I knew I wanted to do creative work. I knew I wanted to tell stories. I didn't really know what medium that was for most of my 20s. So a lot of that period was me figuring that out. And then, paying my rent and saving lives in the course of that, right?
Yeah, man.
Which was fun. And hard, but also really a great education for a writer or any creative in a lot of ways. So I spent a lot of time putting songs together and trying to tell stories that way, and that was fun. And I love music is a big part of me, no matter what I do. But ultimately, what kind of led me to the table as a writer of books was getting fed up with having to wrangle people a lot. Musicians are amazing people, but they don't, it was just like the work of like getting people to show up, both musicians and audience members to shows and everything else. It was like I was spending so much of my energy not on the creative part. And I was like, the idea of sitting down and writing a book seemed so freeing because it was just me. It was just me and the laptop. And that's what it was. And that is what it became. I still play music, but it's much more like just what I do for fun. Whereas writing really took over as kind of my first language as an artist and as a professional artist.
Very cool. And I have a huge amount of respect for first responders.
Thank you.
And I know how stressful, we've actually talked on the podcast about that, about how stressful, about how, oh man, like you see some stuff and you have to deal with some stuff as well. So I was wondering, maybe could you talk about that and like,
Sure.
Especially as that relates to wanting to be a creative person too?
Yeah. I always tell people like the stress of the job isn't actually in general, with exceptions, the stress of the job generally isn't what people expect it to be. Because you enter a little bit of a different mindset when you go to work as someone who, may or may not deal with death, like in a very face-to-face way, as part of your job, right? It's not like you're walking down the street and someone gets hit by a car and you have to like think fast and respond. It's like you're sent to that person who got hit by a car with a whole bunch of tools and a whole bunch of backup to play a very specific role in getting them to be alive and to make it to the hospital, right? And that's just a very different mindset to go into. So like when that happens, that's your job to do it. Now that doesn't mean like it's easy, and it doesn't mean it's fun, and it doesn't mean it's not stressful to have people's lives in your hands, but there is a sense of like, I'm here fulfilling the job that I trained to do and that I'm here to do, on a number of levels, right? And it is a very stressful job, mostly because of the other things that make regular jobs also stressful, like politics, like business, like just basic BS. Are we swearing on this? Can we swear?
Yeah, please.
Hey, bullshit between people.
Bullshit.
The bullshit between people, like just the bullshit of bureaucracy. And if you read especially some of my early work, and specifically I'm thinking of the Bone Street Rumba, which is my adult urban fantasy series, that's very much about the bureaucracy of life and death and how frustrating it is to be someone who has a job or a mission or whatever it may be that they believe deeply in, and then is forced to kind of curb that into the weird boxes of bureaucracy, whatever that may mean. So it was stressful in that sense. And I always say like the hardest parts of that job were the things that we actually couldn't do anything about. If you come up on a scene and someone's had a heart attack, you're perfectly equipped to deal with that. And so you do, and you do all this stuff, and you may lose them. They may not make it, but you've done what you can do and you really put your whole self into it. And then you walk away having done your best, and you're somewhat cleansed of the trauma of being around so much devastation just by the act of taking part in trying to make it better, which I think is a metaphor that actually really applies to sort of like everything. Like that's why I write, is because the world is very destroyed. It's very fucked up. It's very much on fire. And the only way that I know how to process that and how to heal it in any way is to write stories and to, speak to it as honestly as I can, speak it, the truth as truly as I can to power. And that's a form of healing for myself too, So I kind of knew that going into being a medic. Like I was very aware of not wanting to just bear witness to something, but also try to take part in making it that much better. But I didn't realize how much that was also a form of healing the self, which it really is. But I knew that also because the hardest parts of that job were the times when we would come up on, like, for instance, a sexual assault case that had been going on for a long time. And then all we could really do as emergency responders was bring the person to the hospital, right? Like they weren't in critical need of like immediate medical intervention. They needed, social work in the sense of like people intervene. They needed community in the sense of people intervening in that abusive relationship and getting them away from it in a healthy way. And that's what's so lacking. And that's also what kind of led me out of that job, is feeling like, seeing those types of situations over and over and just feeling really like all I was doing was kind of bringing people back and forth to the hospital, and their situations were going on, whether it was with addiction or relationships or what have you. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, I love it.
You have a lot of thoughts when you're on the ambulance.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that that idea of switching careers, but I have to dive into right now the idea of community, because that's so important.
Yeah.
To, at least it's very evident in your writing.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And I think that you could probably also very eloquently speak on the fact that, you know, when the world is on fire and fucked up and there's all kinds of issues that every human has to deal with, some that have to deal with more than others. But when it comes to writing, and how did you kind of find your voice to tell the story that you wanted to tell to the audience that you wanted to tell it to?
It's a really great question, because as a writing teacher now, that's something that I really have thought a lot about too, in terms of, that's, to me, like, voice is the one thing you can't teach, right? Like, it's like, well, you're a nerd, you understand this. Like, you know how, like, the Jedi have to go off on a mission to kind of face their own fears in order to truly become a Jedi, right? Like, when you're going to get your kyber crystal in the lightsaber cave, like that's you only can face like all those weird hallucinations that are your very personal fears. And that's the only way to overcoming them, is the only way to truly become a Jedi. That's true of being a writer with a voice too, I think. In that, you know, as a teacher, all I can do is say, like, you're about to go off on this mission, and I will try to be here for you, you know, when you have questions, but ultimately you have to go down that road alone and come back alone. And then here we are. And what they don't tell you is that that's something that goes on for your whole writing life. It's not just that you go and come back and then you're done. You get to check off that box, right? Because every book, every project, every character is like a fractal of the larger thing that is your writer voice. And figuring out how to maneuver through that and around that, you know, throughout your career is its own kind of deeper quest that's involved with that. But, you know, ultimately it's also like, it's hard, and it's, you know, gut wrenching sometimes, and it requires soul searching. But that's the great thing about it too, is that it's the journey that makes us, you know. So mine definitely involved the streets of Brooklyn as a healer, as a medic, as an organizer, as a musician. You know, all of those things were very wound up in my journey, in my creative journey, and as part of my voice. And then the last thing I'll say about that was, I was always very clear that I wanted my work to honor the voices of people who were telling stories, you know, around me, as much as it honored the literature that came before me, you know. And I think that's a personal choice, because I personally love and really just admire, like, the spoken word of storytelling. And I just wanted that to be true on the page, like that respect to come true on the page, whether it was in the narrative voice, the narrator voice, or the characters around the main character, you know, however that needed to come through. That was always really important to me, because that's how I learned about story, first and foremost, was by hearing stories. And then also, certainly, like, I grew up in a bookish house full of great literature. And I grew up, you know, surrounded by great movies, and including Star Wars. And so I feel like all of those really work together, and we're at our best artistically when we honor those voices, you know, and without trying to create hierarchies of like, oh no, this is real literature because this dead guy wrote it, you know, or whatever bullshit we do. The dude at the bodega, like, has as many good stories as Homer did, you know, if we pay attention. And paramedics, I will say, finally, are some good ass storytellers. And I certainly learned so much, or just, you know, just took in so much as we all sat around, you know, the break room shooting the shit. And those are just all pieces of that bigger puzzle that is voice.
For sure. And I think you touched on a really important aspect of creativity, not just for like writers, but for any type of artist or creative person. It's not just like standing on the shoulders of giants, of the people that came before you, of great writers or great people that inspired you. But I think it's like the role and like the responsibility of creative people to also kind of use that as like a foundation, like as like a scaffolding, but then like insert everything else from your personal experience, because like you're the only one that's lived your life and has taken all of the like inputs that you've received from parents, from teachers, from community members. Yeah. It's like kind of your role to like insert that, to share that to your audience, to other people.
That's why I have a little bit of a side eye when the sort of like traditional writer's advice kind of motif of like, just read all the time. Anytime you're not writing, you should be reading. And like, obviously, I don't mean you shouldn't read a lot. Of course you should read a lot. I think what that can sort of leave out is in danger of leaving out if it's not explained properly is just how much of exactly what you just said, that lived experience is really that's really the bones and the blood of being a writer, is what you've lived, not what you've read. And you are in danger of getting sort of repetitive if the only thing you're drawing from is other books. Like you have to have your heart broken. You have to, unfortunately, like go through these very human experiences of being alive and struggling with things and walking through those very particular fires of identity, of responsibility, and what it means to be alive in this particular society. That's how you write great books, teamed up with an understanding of how literature works, which is what you get from reading great books.
Right. And it also allows you to insert, like when you're talking about paramedics telling good stories or people at the bodega being great storytellers.
Yeah.
In your writing, what I've noticed is your dialogue is amazing.
Oh,
like it is.
Thank you.
Oh, dude, it's so. You feel like it actually was said, like you just kind of like wrote down what people said. So where does that come from? Was that like a natural thing for you to be able to write that way? Because I know that I struggle with dialogue as a writer. I know other people do too, in terms of making it sound natural, to making it sound like it came from real life as opposed to like just like on the written page.
Right. Yeah. Dialogue, in a certain level, it's always been very straightforward to me. On the other level, I think where I had to really do the work was in putting it in the service of story, right? Because from where I stood, like I could write pages and pages of characters just hanging out and talking shit. You know what I mean? And,
just shooting the shit.
Shooting the shit. Like I could literally write a book about that, and I think it would have people fooled for like a couple chapters, and then it would be like, is there a story though? Like,
where are we going?
Yeah, where are we going with this? I mean, some people like books like that. I really need a story, so I should say it would fool me for a couple chapters, and then eventually I'd be like, look, guys, like I need you to, solve a problem somewhere in this situation. But knowing that about myself then meant like, okay, how then do I make sure that this dialogue stays very alive and feels very fluid and natural, but also brings us to the point and doesn't just run off? Because I could have, it's just the temptation is there. But I do feel like it gets to the central question of what writing is really about, which is listening. And I think if you can't listen, if you refuse to listen, or if you don't put the time into truly listening to people, you just won't be a good writer, like ultimately. And that's like a sort of dialogue is like a very obvious form of listening in some ways. Because if you just sit out anywhere in public, you will hear people and hear the natural rhythms of their voice and how they, rag on each other and have fun and hate each other and everything else. And that's like a very obvious form of listening. And then, of course, like what we've been talking about this whole time is that deeper level of listening to the self, to, spirit, to the world around you, to questions about power and privilege and things like that. And that's just, I just bring that up because it's just so not dealt with from my experience enough in MFA programs or writer guides or anything else. Like you have to listen, period.
Oh, for sure. And I think it helps any creative person, regardless, to hear where people are coming from and to not just hear what they're saying, but how they're saying it. There's so much more that's said.
Yeah. I mean, musicians, like it's not about the chops that you have. It's really about your ability to hear the music around you and be in conversation with it rather than just play a great solo, right?
For sure. Now, so let's go back to the idea of you being a paramedic for a decade.
Right.
And then realizing that you needed kind of a change or like feeling that kind of desire to tell a story in a different way and maybe, switch things up. What was the process of writing Shadowshaper? That is the book that you wrote first, right?
Yep. That's right. And it was, I definitely got into being a medic knowing it was kind of a stepping stool job for me personally.
Temporary.
It's not I don't want to qualify it as a stepping stool job because I think it's an amazing career for people to have their whole lives. I knew that I was trying to do something creative full time. And I knew that I had to pay my rent in the meantime. And I knew that I had a lot to learn about life and that being a medic would teach me a lot. So all of those things were kind of in my processing, but that was the job I got right out of college, right? And that's what I did. So I was trying to figure out how to get off the ambulance, but not with any urgency because it was such a great job. And I just was like really learning and benefiting from it a lot. But yeah, it was really that moment. I mean, I'll tell you the month. It was very very specifically January 2009, so 11 years ago, sitting down and having that revelation of being like, I could just write a book and it would be just me, you know. So I wrote it. I'm a Capricorn, and we get excited about stuff, so we do it fast. That's what happened. I wrote it in like maybe a month and a half or something, the first draft, which I actually have posted online because it is radically different than the final book that you hold in your hands. It's literally like an entire different mythology. It's much more middle grade feeling. It's a younger slant, and it's just much goofier. It's full of weird monsters. It's super cool. But I did that beginner mistake of like shoving everything I'd ever thought of into the book, you know, because I was a Star Wars fan. So I'd been making up monsters in my head for like, 25 years at that point. And I just was like, I don't know if I'll ever write another book. So let me put them all in Brooklyn at the same time. It was a very crowded book. And then, in the process of submitting it and getting notes from potential agents who were very kind and generous with their time, considering they didn't represent me, but they just gave really great notes. Nathan Bransford is one who's really great and instrumental in that. But yeah, just learning about the publishing industry. I started submitting it and getting rejected literally 40 times. But in the meantime, I was writing short stories. I took a class and started submitting those, and those got rejected. And eventually, literally a couple of years later, it took before any kind of traction was starting to hit. Shadowshaper didn't get accepted anywhere until 2012. Yeah. And then it went through more edits, at Scholastic and then it came out in 2015.
Okay, there's a lot of different ways I want to go here.
Yeah, I know,
there's a lot of questions I have.
An epic story, right there.
No, it's great. There's so many great elements to it. So when were you finding time, like, because you were working full time as a paramedic?
Yeah.
So when were you finding the time to write it? You said like a couple months?
Yeah. Well, the cool thing, yes, it is.
I just want to applaud you.
Thank you.
Capricorn or not, that's a feat, man.
I was excited. I was like, holy shit! I don't have to get anybody's schedule lined up. I don't have to wait for anybody to show up. Like, it just seems such a raw creative process compared to, because I was doing production too when I was trying to. I wasn't trained in production, but when I was doing soundtracks for people, for whether it's dancers, choreographers, or filmmakers, I would have to produce it too, and I hated it. Like, I was like, I'm not trained in this shit. It doesn't sound that good, and I just want to write songs and stories. So all that energy and money, was just going into not just whatever. So yeah, it was like that raw creative energy, spending all my time on that, and that was all creativity. It felt so good. But the time question is interesting. Another reason that being a medic is such a fantastic job for someone who is in a creative industry or freelancing on the side is that in the particular situation I was in, my hours we did 12-hour shifts. So a full week was 3 shifts. So I had 4 days off a week. So like, that's when I wrote, basically. Every once in a while I would work a really slow shift at the top of the Bronx in this area that just had only nursing homes. And I would bring my laptop and I would just sit in the back of the ambulance and write. And it was literally midnight to noon. It was a fucked up tour.
Wow.
Yeah. But I knew I would only get 2 jobs in a 12-hour shift, or 2 or 3, and I would just write for the majority of the time. So I got a lot of work done that way, or some. And then I just mostly worked on my past days. And it was great.
That's something or at least a theme that comes up. And I never want to advise anyone to quit a job to do your creative passion. But it seems like the thing that we're in this podcast where we've kind of landed on is, having one foot in the door, one foot out the door, having the stability. So you're not like you said, the desperation or urgency, isn't necessarily there where you're like, I need to do this. And then that's finding its way into your creative process where you can kind of maybe take your time. It seems like you didn't take your time, but where you have a little bit of leeway to be able to take some time to write that novel, or especially when it takes so long to sell it.
That's the thing. I didn't take my time, but the industry did take its time. And yeah, so, which is even probably in the middle of, the lengths of time I know people who certainly, it's taken longer, and mind you, this was before we need diverse books, so a lot of the rejections I was getting were and this still happens, but they code it differently, but I don't know if we could sell books with people of color that are fantasy and all this shit, or they would say it in some cutesy way that veiled the racism very thinly or whatever. So there's that. I will also say, I come from a comfortable middle class background, and I certainly had a sense of a safety net in terms of like, I knew if I didn't, it wasn't like if I didn't sell the book, I wasn't going to make it or wasn't going to like get through. Like I wouldn't have been comfortable, but I would have figured out a way, and I had backup for sure. And then when I left being a medic, the year I did my MFA program in the 2 years straddling before and after I left being a medic. And that was a very strategic professional decision to be able to have some sort of a teaching possibility while I was still getting my career together. So there's strategy involved, I guess. There's a piece of it that's strategy, and there's a piece that's very much like intuition. Because I did leave my job before I had like a real career. I think I'd sold a book, or South Nocturnal was out or about to come out, and I'd sold Shadowshaper, but that's not a career. That wasn't enough to support me, but I knew I was done in the ambulance, and I had to put that behind me in order to move forward. And that was where teaching came in, was like, okay, here's something I can do that potentially won't take up all my time if I play it right, and it can help my income too.
Very smart.
Yeah, it worked out.
Okay, so now I want to talk about Rejection.
Oh yeah, let's talk about that.
So 40 times getting rejected.
Yes.
And I think that that's one of the biggest resistances, or one of the biggest fears is for creative people in any type of thing, or really any human, is just like the fear of rejection.
Yeah.
So what did you find helped to motivate you through after the first rejection to, get that second rejection all the way up to 40?
It was, it's a great question. I've always had a weird, relationship to it, because I would get sort of simultaneous, really good feedback along with rejections. And that would always happen in a certain balance. And I think that was helpful, because I would have people saying like, wow, I've never read anything like this. This is so amazing. Like, the streets need this book, like all this great stuff. And then I would just get rejected. So that helped me, as much as I would like to say, like, it was all just internal drive. I definitely like really did benefit from people believing in me on the side. And mostly that was Black women. The other writers, people I looked up to, Cherie Renee Thomas was a big just inspiration and mentor for me, who's a great writer and editor. She did the Dark Matter anthologies. It's a series of anthologies that came out like 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, of speculative fiction from the African diaspora. And she was who I took the short story writing class with. She kind of took me under her wing. Tananarive Due was another person I studied with at my master's program. But yeah, there were just people along the way. Nathan Bransford, who I mentioned, was another one who just really like saw what I was trying to do and knew that it was going to be hard for me to do it. And were very honest with me about that, about the industry and just how fucked up it is and how racist it can be and often is. And, but still like had my back and pushed me and encouraged me, throughout. So it was that, and then meanwhile, the industry was rejecting me. So I was like, all right, I know I'm doing something right. And I know the thing that I'm doing right is the thing that matters most to me. And I know this kind of gets into the editing conversation, but I knew what the heart of Shadowshaper was. And I knew that it was a book about kids of color having an amazing magical adventure in Brooklyn. That's what I wanted to do. And so knowing that, it gave me a tremendous amount of leeway. So when Nathan came back and was like, look, man, the second 2/3 of this book are a total mess, but the first third is like one of the best things I've ever seen in my inbox. So if you want to cut it back and retool all the mythology and see where it gets you, I'd be super interested in reading it again. And I was like, you know what? Right. Which sounds devastating, but I was like, A, I don't have shit else going on, really. B, like he had a really good understanding of what the heart of the book was. And so did I. Even though I wouldn't have been able to articulate it clearly necessarily at the time, I still knew in my heart, like, the book isn't about like the particular adventures that play out in that draft that I wrote. The book is about these characters and these kids and trying to stake out this territory of magic, adventure, and having an honest conversation about race and privilege and other things, but without letting either overtake the other. And I really believed I could do that, apart from reading Octavia Butler and then other stuff, but also from not seeing a lot of that out there and feeling like I wanted it more from my fantasy. Like at the time, it was like Octavia Butler was doing it, Nalo Hopkinson and Tananarive Due were doing it, but it wasn't a lot of folks out there trying to have the conversation about race mixed in with fantasy. And, I knew that was a conversation I wanted to have and I could have from my past experiences. So that meant I knew what to fight for and what I could let go of. And that allowed me to very relatively, I would say easily, say like, you know what? Yeah, let me actually cut this back and see where I go if I just take it in a whole different direction. And I mean, at the end of the day, like I love writing and I love making up stories and mythologies and worlds. So I just kind of just took it as a whole new book and went in like that. And that's really how it all happened.
And Shadowshaper really does have heart. Like when you said that, like think of the heart of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, I'm thinking of like the moment, I'm just thinking of Sierra like looking in the mirror. You know what I mean? And like the questions the things that she's thinking right there.
And that scene's been in there from the first draft. Like that's one of those moments. Exactly. Like that moment, her and Robbie dancing at the club when the murals come to life. That was in the first draft. A lot of those moments that are so key to what it is survived because that's the heart of the book. And I knew that. And that's the work.
Well, I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit more on that idea of like writing what you know. Like you didn't, aside from Octavia Butler, like not seeing it in the world, but it's still like the story that you want to tell. Cause I'm always kind of promoting, write your own story regardless of like, this is going to be a really interesting conversation actually, because I just made a video because I saw Neil deGrasse Tyson talk. It really inspired me because it was all about things we don't know, like that scientists don't know, like dark matter, like the multiverse, just like questions that we still don't have answers to. And also like how scientists have been wrong in the past. And that really inspired me because I love writing about like outer space and like stuff like that. But who am I? I'm just a guy that's like watched a few documentaries and read a few books about space.
Sure.
Who am I to write about that? But so what's that book that's out? American Dirt right now. And it's like, so like, that's the dichotomy that I'm thinking about. Like, so who am I to write about science, but then who is that author to write about that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where's the line?
Right.
And then like, how do you find the inspiration then when you don't see it out in the world?
Right.
That was like a really long multi-part question. I apologize for that,
right.
But hopefully you kind of see where I'm going.
No, totally. Yeah. Let me think. See, first of all, it's a great question. And it's something I think every writer is consciously or subconsciously struggling with. And I think the more we consciously struggle with it, the better off we are. It kind of gets to the other question related, tangential, about do we include, quote unquote, do we include politics in our writing, right? Which is to me like a slightly ridiculous question, but it's because it's really a question of how, right? Like it's all there. It's just like, do we allow ourselves to be thoughtful and strategic about it as much as we are thoughtful and strategic about any other element of literature that we think through? Like, and what kills me is that writers so often want to sort of be passive about it and act like so many times when I've asked writers, how do you think about how you bring politics into your work? So often, particularly I found from white writers, they'll say, "Oh, I don't think about it. I just let it happen naturally." And I was like, it cracks me up because like you just never hear writers say that about any other element of craft. We love talking about how intentional we were about that foreshadowing that we put in the first chapter. And, I was so so thoughtful because I specifically did this and it was a callback to that and all this other shit. And it's like, why would you want to just pretend that you don't have any thought in your head about politics when that's not a good strategy, especially when, if you're paying attention, that like, if you try to be neutral on a moving train, right, as the Howardson quote tells us, like you can't because it's moving, and that's a reality. So, it's not to say it's sort of the opposite, I think, of what like people tend to think of as like being political with your work. They think that means that you're beating people over the head. It's really that if you're strategic about it, that's exactly what you're not doing. But if you try to just like pass the baton and pretend that you're not thinking that hard about it or don't think that hard about it, you will probably be very plotting and ridiculous and over the top with your politics, which are there anyway. And that's what we've sort of seen over and over. I think the interesting conversation that we don't have enough actually is about the way that fantasy can feel like home and can feel like the deeper truth, even when it's something so, like you said, outer space, or magical, that gets to these truths of our lives that we feel very comfortable with and at home in. I'll shout out an essay I wrote that's been making the rounds a lot recently, even though it was about 6 years ago. I think I wrote it. It's on BuzzFeed. It's called 12 Fundamentals of Writing the Other and the Self. that really deals with that question exactly of right and the other. And I'm really happy it's gotten play. People have like kind of revived it in the wake of the American Dirt situation as a way of having this conversation. So that's really cool. But what I think is interesting that we don't talk a lot about is this idea. Like, so many people have come to me and said Shadowshaper felt like home. And Shadowshaper is a fantasy book. You know what I mean? It's a fantasy book that's deeply grounded in reality, but it's still a fantasy. And you know what I think about a lot is the moment, there's a Miyazaki moment that people talk a lot about in the movie Spirited Away, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. You know, when the girl is getting up, she puts her shoe on and she's running off. And she just does this little tap to get her foot snug into her sneaker right before she runs off. And it's like the slightest detail. And it's such a moment of just her being a young girl. And it's so real. And I think so many people, like, first of all, I'm sure it flew past me like the first 12 times I saw the movie. I think someone had to point it out for me to be like, oh shit, you know, but like subconsciously, I think we all see that moment and think like deep down, or don't even think, but just feel and understand intrinsically, like that's a real human girl and we believe in her. And so that kind of anchors the allows, I think, the movie to then go on to just be a total majestic fantasy with flying dragons and, you know, witches and all spirits and everything else, because we're grounded in that moment of how real that girl is and how human she is. And I think like that's fantasy right there. Like that's the whole game, is finding that balance, whatever that sweet spot is for you as a creative, and being like, here's what's true and here's the world of magic I'm going to build around it. And that's kind of the constant interplay and conversation we're having. So for Shadowshaper, like I said, like I knew I wanted to have a very real conversation about Brooklyn, in part because, yes, it is my politics, in part because it's true. And it's a truth that we don't see in books. There's so many books about the city. At the time, particularly, urban fantasy was like a very white subgenre or genre, whatever. And the city that we would see in urban fantasy was just not one that I recognized to be true in any real way. It was either like totally just like cutesy and everything was great and all white people, or it was like total urban devastation and all brown people shooting each other, you know? And I was like, neither of these things are true. Like I grew up in the city and this ain't it. And so I wanted to tell the truth, which is unfortunately a political thing to do, but also it's the job of the writer is to tell the truth.
I also wanted to ask you about kind of like going against the quote rules. You have this video, which is hilarious, but also like really made me think about why we don't italicize Spanish.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's like, it makes, I was like sitting there thinking, I'm like, yeah, that's so fucking true. That's so true. Like why you're like, just the ridiculousness that you portrayed, or that you showed, that, you know, how ridiculous, you know, italicizing just a different language is.
La biblioteca.
Like if people can't figure La biblioteca. But like if people can't figure that out, like that's a Spanish word, like you got a different set of problems. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And that's always the argument. It's like, well, what if they, you know, it helps. And I'm like, why are we catering to the lowest common denominator? Like, really what you're talking about, you know, like it just doesn't, that's not what makes anything good.
So is that something like not italicizing Spanish? Mm-hmm. Like, is that something that you feel like you do in your writing, like to fight, not to fight against, but like a rule that exists now, but probably won't exist later? Do you feel like you're in your writing, like you're pushing towards that kind of a future? If that makes any sense?
Sure. That's that's sort of part of it. I'll say one thing that's been really gratifying about that video, which is like a minute long. Like it's like, you know, it's like completely done its work in the world. Like I literally made it and then sent it and posted it a couple of years ago, and it went viral. And then even more than that, people, I know it's been passed around from editor to editor in the publishing industry, because I'm constantly getting emails from editors being like, wow, I never thought of this, but I'll never do it again. You know, and writers who are like, I sent this to my editor when they gave me any kind of like heat about not italicizing, and it totally transformed their, you know, and that's super gratifying and awesome. I feel like I'm writing to get the world to be what I know it to be, if that makes sense. I know that we don't talk like that, and I want books to reflect that. And so on the one hand, I guess that's sort of like, I'm like, this is how it should be, but I'm like, this is how it is. Let's act like it. It's really that's how I feel. Like, you know, I'm like, I do think a lot of being a writer, whoever you are or whatever you believe in, is about knowing what hills are worth shedding blood on. And that's another thing that I think people just don't talk enough about or tell younger writers. I always try to. I talk about it on Twitter as much as possible. Just that, like, decision fatigue, first of all, is a real thing. But as a writer, you're constantly having to make decisions, and they're tiny, and even the tiniest ones mean a lot. Like, think about it. Like, if you're not already thinking about that stuff, like whether or not you italicize a word that's not English, it doesn't feel like a huge decision. But it actually really is. It has it has importance. It matters to different people in different ways. And it's literally how we understand the other and the self. It's a lot of shit. And that's true of basically every decision you're making, whether it's about, the typeface on your typeset on your cover, whether it's about the images, whether it's about the copy on the back of your book, like all these things that hopefully, if you're in a good situation, they're actually asking you about. They should be asking you about it. And you should have some say over it, if not contractually, at least just in the relationship with your publisher. And it's exhausting. And it's like hard to know, like what's the right thing to go do, and what are the consequences going to be? And like, is it going to affect your sales? Is it going to affect, how people view you in the world? Like all this shit. That's why we do it, because it matters. That's true of story. We're writing the mythology of this time when we write stories. And it should matter, and it does matter, and so it's a responsibility. I know I take very seriously, and I love and cherish, and it's exhausting and dangerous considering that we live in a very racist world, a very sexist world, and publishing is very far from being immune to that, and very entrenched in its own shit. And so we're just constantly trying to figure all those things out at the same time, and sort of like live our best lives and have integrity. And that's very complicated as a writer.
Well, I applaud you for the way that you approach it.
Thank you.
Yeah, man. And well, I mean, kind of going back to the video, like a really effective way sometimes is through humor. Like you said, instead of just doing it in all your writing, like unitalicizing or never italicizing Spanish words, like making a 1-minute video that just like can speak to someone so much. Like I said, like I'll never do it now, like just because it makes so much sense the way you portrayed that, because you were able to connect through humor, and you're able to connect really well through humor in your writing as well. That's like a really effective way to kind of break through barriers and to like kind of cut the tension, but also still kind of share your message.
A lot of that I put it's not false humbleness when I say that it's my characters who are actually funny, because usually I know I created them, so I'll take that. But like they are like usually my mechanism for humor is through them. Like it's so easy to set up a joke, with the character, and then like, because you're the one writing the whole scene, right? So you can sort of like let them be as sarcastic or ridiculous as you need to, and then run with it. I will say that, like having worked with young people for years, because that whole time that I was doing the ambulance work and everything else, I was also teaching in different ways, whether it's workshops or I actually taught music at a couple different mental wards to kids in different hospitals, like mental health hospitals. That's awesome. Yeah, that was really cool. I did a lot of organizing work with kids, theater, stuff like that. So I was always around young people, and I learned a lot from them. I mean, in terms of that question of voice and dialogue, for sure. But young people are the funniest people. Like, just naturally, it's natural to them to be funny. They're hilarious. They're constantly taking the piss out of each other. When they're really good at it, they know how to do it without actually hurting people's feelings. You know what I mean? Like, they will just, sometimes fucking with other people is a way that we show love. And it's a fine line. And sometimes it's really not, and that's real too. But they're hilarious. and I think a lot of the humor in my work is directly from, whether it's that or the folks, paramedics, or another very funny group of people who know how to, like, you'll be sitting there in a room full of paramedics and we'll be talking trash, and suddenly you'll be like, wait, someone died. Like, y'all are telling a story about someone who died, and we're all here laughing. And it's not because people are cold hearted. It's totally the opposite. It's because y'all know you're in this together, and everyone who was involved did their damnedest, like put their sweat and blood and entire life into bringing that person back to life. And it may or may not have worked, but either way, something funny happened in the course of it, and we still gonna laugh at that funny thing. And an outsider would probably misunderstand that situation deeply, and I would understand them misunderstanding it. But I will say that there's a lot of humor in, and I guess people, gallows humor, whatever it's called. Shit's funny.
Shit's funny. No, that is the way to. That's why I like it's always surprising to me, like when I'm at a wake or like after a funeral, it's like, why are people laughing? And it's like, oh, because this is how we cope.
Right. Well, here in New Orleans, we throw a big marching parade when someone dies, and there's a long history of figuring out ways to find the joy in those moments of sorrow. And I think it's always interesting to wonder about how literature can do that too. Like can sort of how can a book be like a second line? Is a question I think we all could ask ourselves.
I also wanted to ask you about, you mentioned that your first draft you have posted online.
Yeah, it's on Wattpad. I meant to say that. Wattpad is that.
Okay.
Yeah, you know that site? It's like social media for a lot of young folks are on there, and just starting out writers and stuff. And so I just posted it in like chapter by chapter a couple years ago, but it's still up there. It's called Sierra Santiago and the Invisible City. And,
wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can see which scenes stayed, which left. Most of the characters are still there. Some of them have different names, but.
And what is it like? What does it feel like when you because I imagine a lot of people would be scared to do that, like to post like their first draft or, something that was quote rejected or, a different version of what something is now. Like I can't imagine putting some of my writing or some of my, like a music video, like an original version, like the idea of that is just like, it's ancient, it's antiquated, and it's something different from what ended up, like coming out. So like, how do you have like the kind of courage to do that?
Oh, thank you. I didn't think of it that way because I like it.
Because you like, okay.
It's pretty good. Like it's, I mean, I think in a different world, it probably would have found a publisher. I think it should have, like, I mean, I'm happy it didn't because I think Shadowshaper is definitely a way better book. But Sierra Santiago and the Invisible City is a cool book with all kinds of weird monsters, and it still talks about gentrification and street harassment, and it still does it with this ridiculous fantasy world around them. I think actually the really interesting thing about that whole thing is that if you read it, the shadow shaping part of it is like a side note. Robbie is the original shadow shaper. It's not even called that. He's part of a crew called the Painted Dead, and it's in a world, like I said, full of all these different monsters. Brooklyn is just covered in monsters, and they're all invisible. That's why it's called the Invisible City. But they all have their own community and problems and everything else. And one of those sort of subsectors of monsters are the actual spirits of the dead who live in painted murals all over the city. And at the end, they all rise up and like kind of like converge on the bad guy, and that's how they win. And I was like, and that was one of the notes from Nathan. He was like, there's so much going on here. Just pick the coolest thing and pull that thread, which is great advice. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what I did. And I was like, you know what? What if the whole book was just this one thing? And that's what made it a much better book.
So when you sit down to rewrite, how long? It was like a couple of years maybe after you wrote it for the first time?
No. I was rewriting it constantly throughout that period.
Oh, okay. So throughout you were...
I was in between short stories, and then I think around 20... At some point I did a draft of it and sent it off back to Nathan, I guess, and then I started writing Half Resurrection Blues because I had been developing that world through short stories. That's the Bone Street Rumba. And so then that was a novel that started as a short story that I felt very strongly that was another thread I could pull. So I pulled that, and that became Half Resurrection Blues. And then I wrote another book called Flood City, which doesn't come out until next year. Check that out. I wrote it 10 years ago.
All right.
And it comes out next year, which is so...
10 years ago?
Yep.
Whoa.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that was, I guess, the third book. I think I wrote it either before or after Half Resurrection Blues, but it was in that period where I was just like, I was waiting for something to happen with Shadowshaper. And it was either, I was waiting for notes to come back or more rejections or whatever. And I'd written a bunch of shorts, and I was like, well, let me try another novel. So I wrote Half Resurrection Blues, and I was like, well, let me try another, whatever.
Okay, so what advice could you maybe give to people, regardless of their creative passion, where does that mindset come from? Where you've got one thing that you finished, maybe it took you a couple months, maybe it took you a year, whatever it is, you're sending it out, trying to get quote acceptance for that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the natural inclination for a lot of people is to be happy with the accomplishment and just to be in that process of trying to get it out there and kind of maybe living in the rejections that are coming back, instead of kind of like, all right, like this, I've done what I can do and I'm going to keep doing what I can do to push it out there. But it's time to create something else to, like, I guess, keep the mind busy, but to also, create a new body of work. So what would your advice and what is the mindset there of being able to continue onward?
Yeah, well, it is actually the best way you want to be working on something else while you're on submission, because otherwise that's all you're doing is being on submission, and that's not doing anything. It's just checking your email, and that's not healthy.
Waiting.
Right? It's waiting, right? I do believe very strongly in taking a break. And so I don't want my advice ever to sound like the second you put down that draft of that old thing, you pick up the next thing. Like, no, stop. Yeah, definitely celebrate the act of, look, there's writing and there's publishing, and they're different things, but they get very conflated in our heads because we know of writing through the mechanism of books that have been published. That's our whole understanding of writing, which is another reason why I think bringing in the idea of oral storytelling more into our kind of understanding of literature is so important. Stories is much bigger than just books, and getting trapped in that kind of like conflation of writing and publishing being one is very bad for your career and bad for your mental health, because it takes away the accomplishment of writing, having written a book. I'll never forget Walter Mosley said that he believes everyone should write a book in the world. He was like, I don't think everyone should publish that book, yes. Which is deep, but it's true. He said, like, the process of writing a book changes you as a person. And that's absolutely true. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a change for the better for everybody. Like, it's always a change for the better, because it forces you to look deep inside yourself on some level and to work through problems and to get, like, to deal with stuff, to be introspective. Like, whatever the book's about, you have to be some level of introspective to get through it. And that's a good thing. So it's like, write the book, write the best book you can write, go through learn what you can learn, get, beta readers and a writing group if you can, or whoever to read it, and then do your edits and then make it even better, and then stop and then, process. And then whatever process you get to where you're like, okay, this is done and I'm ready to submit it, and you submit it, then stop and appreciate that fact. Not, like, try to separate, like, whether or not it gets picked up or whatever it's not it. It's like, you wrote a book. That's huge. Most people don't, and it's amazing. And so do that, feel it, appreciate it, honor yourself in your process. And of course, meanwhile, learn about the industry, have a deep understanding of it as much as you can. First of all, have a surface understanding of it. So you know what's happening around you, because any business, this is a side note, but this is what kills me about MFA programs who want to pretend that, like, talking about the business of writing is somehow anathema to, like, being a good writer. You have to. What other trade, like, sends people out into the world with no understanding about the business of what they're doing? It's complete bullshit. And fortunately, it seems like it's on the rise to now finally talk about business of writing in MFA programs, but it's absolutely ridiculous that they don't more often. That's my little rant on that. Anyway, and then if you love being a writer, then you will naturally start the next project. I mean, you will get that itch, and it's no one likes being on submission. If you want to be a writer, then you will write. And so it's exciting. I would say, don't write the sequel. That shouldn't be your next project for a number of reasons. That's not it. Start something totally new. And lastly, I'll say short stories are really helpful. I personally don't love writing them anymore, but they were really good for me to, first of all, get myself out there. Second of all, start to understand how publishing works. Third of all, get rejected and get used to getting rejected and get accepted sometimes, and just learn about the craft of making the mechanics of story work in a very condensed way. Like, that's lived experience in terms of writing. So, push yourself. Even if you don't like writing short stories, make yourself write some damn short stories and practice getting them out there.
Yeah, and I think that's a hold up too for people and myself. I have been struggling to write my Your Creative Push book forever, but I think that also has to do with it being a book. And
sure.
The way that I kind of want to put messages out there is in smaller messages, and whether that's like a blog post or a short story, I think it's touching on what you said about, taking a break.
Yeah.
Stephen Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art, like, I love that book and turning pro, and that's the whole reason I use the word resistances, and kind of one of the reasons why this podcast exists.
Right.
But one of the things I wholeheartedly disagree with him is, like, he's like, all right, you write your book, say, and then literally as soon as you're done writing the last word of that book, you write the first word of the next one. Like, there's like no time in there. Yeah, like, I'm like, no, it's like so important to be proud of yourself, to live in that accomplishment for a period of time. It's and doing short stories or small paintings or whatever it is, like, it's really important to cherish those small victories.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It gets into another conversation that I've weighed in on heavily is the writing every day thing. I have an essay up called Writing Begins with Forgiveness on a site called Seven Scribes, where I really try to get into that because I think it's terrible advice. Unless you happen to be that like one out of every probably million people that is like, I love writing every day. It's what I want to do all the time.
Stephen King.
Yeah. He's a big one on that. And I think it's terrible advice. I just think it really makes people feel ashamed for all the days that they can't write, which is a very real thing. And which, like I said, as prolific as I am, and I don't say this to brag, because I don't actually think it's necessarily something to brag about. Like, being prolific, you could still be a terrible writer. Like, I'm proud that I've written great books. That's a brag. But so the number of books, it's really cool, and I'm glad I've written them. But regardless, I am prolific, and I definitely don't write every day. And I just want people to know that. Like, I go months without writing. In fact, I went an entire year without writing last year. And I will swear by that every single day, because it is really clutch to me being who I am right now and who I will become. And all those, that year, when I know that when I look back on my career, that year of not writing will be as important as the 5 years I spent before that, publishing in major houses. That's how the world works. That's how creativity works. It doesn't work from being a machine or a factory or anything else, period.
Amen. I just got off a 7 or 8 month break from the podcast.
Oh, good.
I feel like a completely different person now. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, it's very, very necessary.
Yeah. And again, no one tells you that. Like, people I haven't seen that advice out there. Like, I had to learn that. I'm glad I was able to listen and like hear what the world was telling me and do it. But like, you don't see people saying like, no, sometimes you need to stop. And yes, there are like financial considerations around that, and you need to figure out what that's going to mean. Like, all those things are true, but none of them are prohibitory. Like, you have to figure out what that's going to mean so that you can do what you need to do. And only you are going to know when in your career that needs to happen. And the way to know it is by being able to listen. And that's hard.
And just speaking about the resistance thing, I mean, you already mentioned kind of the resistances of the outside world, of the ugly publishing world, and stuff like that. But in terms of like you as a writer, as a creative person, like when it comes to whether it's needing a break or whatever, are there any resistances you encounter maybe in your history and then maybe still today?
Before I started, I know one of the things holding me back was kind of what we talked about a little bit. It's just the idea that sort of a book was like this thing on this pedestal that was just sort of untouchable and only certain people could do. And I just didn't know if it was in me to write a good enough book to be worth writing a book, which is actually not a good way to think of it at all. But I think the way a lot of us probably think of it, especially before we've written a book, because it just seems like something other people do. Yeah, I don't know. There's so many dynamics to that. But for me, like the process of getting over that happened through blogging. And it happened by mistake. I wasn't trying to get over it. I just, because I didn't really know it was in my way. I knew I wanted to be creative. I didn't know how, But I blogged out a lot of stuff that happened on the ambulance. And this is all online too, actually. It's on my website. And I would just come home and write, whatever happened the night before. And it would take me 10 minutes. And I would just knock out this like pretty cool, little interesting, like vignette. I wouldn't even say it was a story because it barely has all the things that a story needs to be a story. It was like a moment, it was like a vignette.
Like a scene.
Yeah, a scene of something that happened, but it was a full scene. It had, there was medical information in it. It was usually funny a little bit, and it was sad or whatever. And they were good. Like they're good. And people were like, wow, this is great stuff. They didn't go viral or anything, but they certainly people were really into them. And I realized like people liked them and I liked them. And then I was like, this was really easy for me. And then I was like, I've really been getting in my own way. And then I was like, if I just made some shit up but did the same thing but was making shit up, that would be fiction. That's what fiction is. It's like you're telling a story that you made up. And it just seems so different to come at it from that way. Because all I was doing was writing what happened. And then I was like, if I make up what happened, then I can still write what happens. It's just some shit I made up. And that's what it is. And that's kind of, from that, the motto became just tell the fucking story, because that is your job as a writer. It's just to tell the fucking story, like not to be super deep, not to like tell someone about how to live their life, like not to give the psychology of the character, just tell the fucking story. And if you trust the story, and if you trust yourself, and if you trust the reader to get what they need out of the story, then that's really all you have to do. It's not that simple, obviously, but on some level it is in terms of like process. Like you sit down and you tell that story. And then later you can go back and you can edit that story into whatever you need it to be. But you can't edit shit if you haven't written shit.
Just tell the fucking story.
It really became my motto.
Advice.
It's still my motto to this day. And when I get stuck, that's usually what I have to remind myself.
Dude, Daniel, this has been awesome, but it's time for the final push. And that's where I ask you to reach through the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today and just give them your final words of advice and push them to pursue their own creative passions.
Sure. So go back to some of those ridiculous stories that you thought about when you were a kid. Tell those stories that you didn't think ever could see the light of day in the world because they were just so out there and weird. And think about those again. And think about how to bring them up to the present day. Think about all the things that you have learned in the in-between time as you grew up and as you learned about the world, as you learned about craft, whatever that may be, as you started to understand power and all of the different forces that are at play as you move through this place. And then think about how you can bring all those elements together. The ridiculous ideas that you had when you were a kid, combined with the knowledge of life and the lived experience and the reading and the craft that you've developed since as an adult. And that is the work ahead of you. And that's what you put on the page.
Dude, Daniel, thank you again so much for coming on the show, for giving us that push, and for sharing an hour with us to give your inspiration. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And for everybody listening, you can find Daniel on his website, danieljoseolder.net, and on Twitter, he is DJ Older, and we'll have that as well as everything we talked about today, those articles that Daniel mentioned at yourcreativepush.com/344. Daniel, thanks again.
Sure.
DJ Older, huge thank you once again for coming on the show, Daniel. I want to reach out and give you a virtual hug because one of the biggest takeaways for me personally was when Daniel said, I just didn't know if it was in me to write a good enough book to be worth writing a book. How often has that thought gone through my head personally, but also how often has that gone through your head, whatever that big project is, that big thing that you know that you need to do, that you feel like you're called to do, but you feel like you're not worthy. You feel like you're an imposter or you are lacking the skills and the confidence to be able to actually accomplish that, to actually create something that's worth being in the world. And so often those feelings come from all the resistances we talk about on this podcast. They come from inside of your own head and not from the outside world that desperately needs that thing, that wants that thing. They just don't know that they need it. They just don't know what it is that you are stewing up in your head. And I love the approach that he took, whether it was consciously or subconsciously, of just writing those stories, those ambulance stories. When he got off of work, taking the 10 to 15 minutes to write those little vignettes he was talking about. Simply what happened that evening, from his eyes, told from his perspective in the way that only he could, putting his own artistic spin on it, and then seeing that people enjoyed those small stories and seeing that he himself enjoyed those stories as well and enjoyed the process of writing them and being able to kind of decompress from work. And in just doing that simple exercise, the pressure was off and he could see himself doing that thing, but for fiction, just writing the story, but making it up, just telling the events, but they came out of his head. And also doing that on a bigger scale. So please, please, please take that lesson from this episode. If you feel unworthy, or if you feel it might not be in you to create something that's worthy of being in the world, take that lesson. Make it simple. If you can find ways to take that pressure off of yourself of creating something that's, quote, worthy of being in the world, and you can instead simply create things and put them into the world, you'll develop that confidence so that you can see that you are worthy and that you can create things that are worthy of being in the world. And then, armed with the confidence that you have from creating all of those things, along with the actual proof of concept of creating all of those things, you will have the confidence to actually create that big thing that you were thinking about all along. On our next episode, we have Piper Thibodeau. Piper is a former full-time character designer for DreamWorks TV, and she is a freelance designer, and she has been making a painting a day for many days. It's been over 2,600 days now. That's over 7 years without missing one. And she comes on the show next week to talk about that entire journey as well as her creative journey as a whole. If you want to find out more about Piper, you can head to her Instagram. She is Piper Draws, and her website is cryptidcreations.com. Or we'll have that all linked up at today's show notes page, as well as everything else we talked about with Daniel at yourcreativepush.com/344. But that's all I've got for you today. So hopefully you were inspired to go and get your creative work done. So go and get it done. I love you all so much. Go and get some amazing work done. And remember, the universe needs your creations, and you are the universe. Bye.